What do you do with your hands when you're talking to no one? Hello, and welcome to Crime and Charcuterie. I'm Tab Macarie, and every Thursday we get together, we talk true crime, and we pair it with a delicious charcuterie board, aka grown-up Lunchables. And speaking of the fact that we are grown-ups, we're also going to throw a little booze into the mix as well. So, you like true crime, you like murder, you like cheese, you're in the right place. So settle in, grab a cocktail, and let's take a look at this week's board. So, I know what you're thinking. This is charcuterie? But the great thing about charcuterie is there's no rules. I think a lot of people, when they hear charcuterie board, cheese boards, they think you have to have bougie wine, overpriced cheese, meats that you can't pronounce and have to be in the shape of a flower, baguettes, da-dun, da-dun.
Oh my god, I feel like Nicole Kidman in Moulin Rouge.
And that all sounds great, and it's delicious, but there are no rules. Much like serial killers, charcuterie boards are lawless. So you do whatever the hell you want, whatever makes you happy, and that is going to be the perfect charcuterie board. And what's really great too is it can open the door to pairings and flavors that maybe you never would have put together before that become your favorite, like Guinness and Lucky Charms. Yeah, we're not going to knock it till we try it. It could be great. Cheers to no boundaries, cheers to the end of the workday, and cheers to good cheese. Now, story time! Obviously, our board is keeping in theme with the fact that it's St. Patty's Day week, and also is our true crime. Today we're going to be talking about Jane Toppan. And depending on who you ask, some say that she is the first female serial killer in America. But we're taking it all the way back to the 1880s, so facts are lost here and there. Regardless, I don't think anybody would disagree when we say Jane and her crimes were heinous.
Not heinous.
Obviously, I don't have to say there's a disclaimer on this whole episode and all of the rest because we're talking about brutal crime. I do swear a little bit, and we're drinking. Jane was actually born Honora Kelly in 1853, March 31st. She was an Aries, born to Irish immigrant parents, first generation in Boston. And while we don't know a whole lot about her older sisters, what we do know is that her mom died of tuberculosis when she was just a baby, leaving her in the care of her loser dad. His real name was Peter Kelly, but his nickname around town was Crackpot Kelly. He was a drunk who beat up his kids, and he stole, and he got in fights, and he was just all around great guy. There's even rumors that later in his life, when he was working as a tailor, he sewed his eyes shut. So when Jane and one of her sisters were respectively 6 and 8, Crackpot Kelly decided that he wasn't winning any Dad of the Year awards, so he dropped them off at a place called the Boston Asylum. Now, this is kind of confusing because asylum, you think, okay, this is a psych ward for little kids. It was actually an orphanage, and the whole plan of this place was actually pretty cool. You would give these girls basic skills until they were age 10, and then you would try to find them placement within an affluent family that would take care of them, put them on the right track, and give them a chance at life when their own family they'd grown up with couldn't. So, when Jane was of age, she was adopted into a family, and Anne Toppan was who brought her into the household. Anne had one daughter of her own, Elizabeth, and Anne immediately wanted to change Honora's identity. Hence, she named her Jane, and she took on the last name of the family as well, Toppan. So she went from Honora Kelly to Jane Toppan. At this time, Irish immigrants were just people talked a lot of shit about him, you know, and they gave him a reputation they didn't deserve. There's just so much negative surrounding being an Irish immigrant, and it was unfounded, and it sucked. Because of that, the new family changed Honora's name to Jane Toppan, and they lied to everybody and said that she was the daughter of this Italian sailor and yada, 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 yada. Just made up a big story for her. So no one would know that they took in an Irish immigrant kid. And so it's important to remember that, because some of the behavior and the stories that Jane spins later, I don't know, like, we're going to blame her, obviously, for all of this shit that she does, but all I'm saying is, seeds were planted here and there. I don't think enough good stuff is said about Irish soda bread. It's so easy to make. All you need is a sheet pan and like 4 ingredients. And it's like salty and satisfying. It's like a really nice texture, like crunchy on the outside and like just this like spongy on the inside. A bit stodgy. That's for you, Paul Hollywood. British Bake Off, anybody?
Great flavour, not very well executed.
Story of my life.
Hey, I like murder and I also like British Bake Off, okay? I'm ambiguous, ambidextrous, well-rounded, a living thesaurus, apparently. So Jane, she's super boisterous and loud and just freaking funny. She's so funny. And the adoptive family kind of made fun of her and gave her a hard time a lot because they called her unattractively fat. Like, shut the hell up. Everybody loved her regardless. And, you know, 2020 looking back, after all of the bullshit came out that Jane ended up doing over her life that we'll get to, they say that she showed just these sociopathic, earmarks, because she would tell tall tales about where she was from. She said her dad was a sailor that had sailed all over the world. I have no idea where she would have gotten that idea from. Do you? Like, it evades me. She also said things like her sisters had married English noblemen, like she had a brother, which she didn't, that was decorated at Gettysburg by, Abraham Lincoln. I mean, she spun some tall tales for sure. But I do want to say something about that. I'm not defending this bitch. But in high school, I don't think it's fair to necessarily say that she had these red flags, because to me, in reading about her experience and the exaggerations, the lies, the drama, even her talking shit on people in school, that to me is the cornerstone of high school. And as someone who, I didn't love high school, okay? Like, I wasn't the most popular person. I wasn't stereotypically beautiful. I could not play any sports to save my life. And so I made up for that, being louder, trying to be funny, trying to find other attributes that in the end, you have to be louder than your insecurities to survive. And I think Jane in high school, that's all she was trying to do. Was she evil inside? Was she a little monster? I don't know. Maybe she was, but I can't say that I would have pinpointed her what she would become later in high school. It's just not fair to say. I get it. It's also important to note that Jane was super smart. I mean, she graduated at the top of her class from her high school. And after she graduated, her adoptive mother, Anne, gave her $50, basically a yearly wage, and was like, hey, I'm not going to call you a servant anymore. You work for me. Thanks a lot. And so Jane did. She stayed on. She worked. And then her adoptive mother, Anne died. And Anne wasn't always the nicest. She was kind of stern. She was definitely fat-phobic and prejudiced. But thanks for giving Jane a home and $50 to clean your toilets. Well, Anne had a daughter, Elizabeth, And Elizabeth had always been really kind, kinder than Anne, really, and more accepting of Jane. And so they had a pretty decent relationship. I mean, maybe not quite sisterly, but they were buddies, like distant cousins or something. Elizabeth kept her on and kept her salary, give her a job. So here's where things get kind of hazy in the history books with this case. From when Jane graduated high school till about 33 years old, we just have to guess that she was just hanging around, Elizabeth's house, living there, working, living the dream. I don't know. We don't know. But then records pick back up when she's around 33, and Elizabeth marries this guy. He's a church deacon. His name is Ormel Brigham. We're just going to call him Brigham because that's easier for me to say. And for whatever reason, he had like this gut feeling he just did not like Jane. And so once he married Elizabeth, he was like, this bitch has to go. I don't like her. Give me the creeps. Get rid of her. You have to understand, this is a really big deal because Jane had lived here for 20 years, most of her life. She was kicked out of her home abruptly, as we're led to believe, because Brigham got the ickies from her. He got the pucker effect. I don't know if you guys follow True Crime Kitchen on YouTube. She's freaking hilarious. I'll link her below. She does videos where she'll cook a meal and she talks true crime. Sometimes she'll do death row last meals, like she did one for Ted Bundy. Anyway, but she talks about this thing called the pucker effect, when you just know that you've encountered the bad guy in the story, right? And you pucker. What am I talking about? Your butthole puckers. Can I say butthole? Can I say butthole? Is that an offense? Does butthole? That's it! We're canceling butthole. She decides, hey, I'm going to go to Cambridge Hospital and I'm going to train to be a nurse. And here we pick up the next chapter of her life in which things start to really go dark. And as you'll hear, the rest of this story, I find it really hard to believe from 18 to 33 that Jane wasn't out there killing people. But what do I know? So when she started nursing school, this is where Jane earned her nickname, Jolly Jane. The reports are kind of nuts because they're across the board, right? A lot of people liked her. The doctors, mainly all the doctors, thought she was the bomb. And a lot of the nursing students with her and the hospital staff, they really liked her too. She was real jovial. She was funny. She was kind of picking back up that personality that she had in high school. But along with the good parts of her personality from high school, she also brought along the obnoxious ones too. And they had just gotten worse. She would gossip about her coworkers. She would make up lies. She would exaggerate stories. Like she would say stuff like, I got this job at this hospital because I know the Tsar of Russia and he hooked me up. And it's like, sure, Jane, sure. But it wasn't just lying and bullshitting and gossiping and stuff like that. She was stealing stuff from people too. And I mean, it wasn't big stuff, but it was enough. I mean, she would kind of look in her coworker's purse and snatch out this or snatch out that, and people caught on, and overall they didn't like her. There was also something about her personality that seemed kind of weird to the hospital staff. The doctors didn't really have time to notice, but the staff, like the receptionist, some of the nurses, night shift, they particularly noticed that Jane was just obsessed with autopsies. And that if it's bothersome, it's got to be off the wall bonkers how she's acting about autopsies and dead bodies. Because when you work in the medical field, of course, she's training, she's learning. She should be, scoping this out. Like, there's nothing wrong with wanting to go down to the morgue and check some stuff out. No one really details what that means, that they were concerned about her obsession, but yeah, we can only imagine. During this time, there's a lot of things going on with Jane that the hospital staff have not noticed that could be way worse than what they have noticed and don't like. Obsession with autopsies and dead people, stealing little things, talking shit. It's almost like Jane, smart Jane, knew what she was doing. All of this petty shit was to cover the bigger shit, which is essentially she was abusing and experimenting with morphine and atropine on her patients. And not just any patients. Jane was smart there too. She picked the older patients, the elderly patients, so that nobody would really notice or take a second look at what was going on, because elderly people die every day. Like, it's not unusual. A lot of times in this hospital at the time, a lot of the patients were coming in to basically be comfortable before their time was done. No one would know to look twice, would they? Nothing seems out of sorts when elderly patients end up really sick, really dying, or rambling about things they might have seen Jane do.
So it seemed to start as just curiosity using these drugs turned into experimentation. And Jane would even, make up fake charts just to get alone time with these elderly patients. And she wanted to experiment and mess with their nervous systems. She was just salacious in wanting to know and wanting to see these patients in between levels of consciousness, almost kill them, bring them back, etc., etc. Now, when Jane was finally caught years and years later, she only copped up to 2 murders during this time when she was training to be a nurse. However, it is believed that there were far more. And here's just an example of a survivor. A couple of years before Jane would finally be dismissed from this hospital, there was a patient named Amelia, and Amelia had this hazy memory of Jane injecting her with something and then standing over her, watching her, before finally crawling into the hospital bed with her and spooning her. Now, she would wake up later and everyone would say, hey, just, chalk it up to a dream. Can you imagine being Amelia or her family, when years later you find out that this creepy ass bitch actually was doing exactly what you thought and you barely survived? Like, I can't even. Finally, they didn't technically fire her, but Jane was recommended to go from the Cambridge Hospital to the super prestigious Massachusetts General Hospital, where she was there for a couple years. She was fired. We don't really know why. It looks like, from what we can gather, it's because, once again, no one liked her there, and they just got a really bad feeling about her. So the crazy part of all this is, I don't know, do these red flags have to be absolutely neon? She gets fired from Massachusetts General, but then her ass goes back to Cambridge, where she started all this heinous. But it gets better. She's there a couple more years, and she starts abusing and experimenting on patients again with opiates. So somebody takes notice. They tell the doctors, and the doctors are like, oh, well, this is a really big deal. You're not accounting for all the opiates that you're using, and that's going to make us look bad, Jane. But you know what? We really, really like you as a person, so we're going to recommend you to be a private nurse to some of our most affluential clients. How big do the red flags have to be? There has to. I don't understand. So then she goes on to her career as a private nurse, and she's doing well, despite the fact that she's still carrying through with petty theft from the people she's working for. So, I don't know, Jane must have really been just, you can't help but like her. Like, she's a piece of crap, but hey, it's Jolly Jane, you know what I'm saying? So then she's flourishing in her life as a private nurse, but she's still killing. And maybe it's not the patients, we're not sure, but that doesn't mean she's not getting it out of her system. In 1895, she killed her landlord, and she killed his wife. Later, when she was caught and she was asked about it, she was like, they were just old and grumpy, and I didn't have time for that, so bye. So she goes and she's starting the next phase of her life, and she's loved, she's successful. I mean, she's making $25 a week at the time, when the average private nurse, even for super wealthy families, is only making about $5 a week. And in her personal life, she's all about town. She loves to guzzle some beer. She curses like an Irish woman. I mean, she's loud and she is not afraid to say some pretty damning things either while she's out at the bar drinking. I mean, she talks about, witnesses would say later, like, old people just need to die. Like, there's no use for them. And she would talk about how she liked to play around with strychnine. Strychnine? Did I say that right? It used to be used in hospitals, I believe, a long time ago. It's a type of rat poison. When it was used in hospitals a millennia ago, like, it used to be for maybe migraines, heart stuff. I'm not really sure. It's kind of all over the place when you research it. But the point is, this is rat poison. And she's talking about it in the bar and how old people have no place in the world. So, again, red flags abound. But despite her reputation about town, despite the facts that she was stealing from people, they loved her. Her clients absolutely loved her. They were able to ignore all of the negative things about Jane because she was jolly, she was smart. She talked like she had a really high skill set as far as nursing and medical anything. So it seems like Jane was kind of laying low when she was a private nurse. Because Jane was such a heavy drinker, she needed more money, even though she was making bank at being a private nurse. She decided she wanted to take a shot at another place in Cambridge called St. John's School as the cafeteria liaison. And she found out about this job because one of her best friends worked there. Well, she thought that her best friend's position sounded awesome. So she killed her friend with strychnine. And she got the job. But it didn't last because, surprise, surprise, Sticky Fingers Jane isn't so jolly when she's taking everybody's stuff out of their purse. Now we're entering the summer of 1899. And I just want to remind you of Elizabeth, her adoptive sister. And they actually, at this point, were still keeping in touch. They had their whole lives, Elizabeth, as I said earlier, was always way kinder to Jane than the mother Anne was. And so Elizabeth would invite Jane to come over to the house and hang out whenever Brigham was out of town. And so it wasn't unusual for them to hang out. And Elizabeth obviously trusted Jane. And at this point, it's been 15 years that Jane has been coasting along as a private nurse, killing people, still uncaught. And she decides that she wants to change the direction of her life. We don't know why. We don't know what brought this up. But she invites Elizabeth out to the beach. Jane just happens to be vacationing for a weekend out at Buzzards Bay. So Elizabeth comes out, and Jane's so sweet. Like, she's packed a picnic, and they're hanging out on the beach, and just talking, reminiscing about the good old times. And this is especially shitty because Elizabeth actually had been suffering from depression. And she had confided in Jane about this. And so she really, when she came down to the beach to hang out with Jane, she really needed the companionship, and she was so vulnerable. And as we know by now, that's exactly how Jane liked it. So they're on the beach, and they're reminiscing, and they're talking about life, and, Jane has this smorgasbord of just yummy food and drinks, and little did Elizabeth know it's all laced with strychnine. So the poison hits Elizabeth, and she starts to die, and it takes her a while. And here's Jane, who later would say, I held her in my arms and just watched her as she was gasping for breath, stroking her hair, letting her die in my arms. But here's something that is a little bit unexpected. Reality didn't exist for her. Remember Brigham, okay? Who freaking hated Jane, kicked her out of her home of 20 years. The reason that she wanted to kill Elizabeth was because she was going to shimmy her way into Elizabeth's household and seduce Brigham into marrying her. She never really elaborated on why she felt like this was a good idea, but this was an awful idea. And we don't exactly know how she got into the house. I would assume that when Elizabeth died, mourners were coming in and out to grieve Elizabeth. And so it was just kind of a part of it. But however she was in the house, and in the brief time that Jane was in the house, she poisoned, because of course she did, the elderly housekeeper. And then she just took it upon herself to be the housekeeper. She just took over. Brigham, meanwhile, is mourning his wife and probably doesn't have 5 seconds to notice this at first. Till he wakes... Really? We don't know why Brigham didn't notice that she took over this role, but when he did, he was super upset, obviously. He's like, I don't want you as a housekeeper, and I don't want you as a wife. Like, get out of my house. And I don't know if he was more patient with Jane because he was mourning and because he knew his late wife had a relationship with Jane. But in that interim that she was still in the house before she left after he tried to kick her out, she freaking poisoned Brigham. She didn't poison him to kill him. Her plan was, okay, I'm going to poison him just enough to bring him back to life, to carry him back to life, and then he'll owe me, and he'll marry me. I have this in the bag. Things like this really make me wonder when you look at history and they call her brilliant and so smart and all this, it's like stuff like this. Is she taking the opiates herself because she's losing her damn mind? But the thing is, with the poisoning, it didn't work. I guess Brigham's resolve or his hatred for her just upped his immune system by 1,000,000%. Because he was pissed. He was like, no, I know what you're doing. I know you did this. Get the hell out of my house.
You're tacky and I hate you.
So then, in a desperate attempt to stay in the house, Jane told him, well, I'm pregnant. And Brigham's like, do you know how babies are made? Because we didn't do that, Jane. We didn't do that. It's not mine. She wasn't really pregnant. That doesn't work. She keeps it going. She poisons herself. Gets herself sent to the hospital thinking, Brigham's going to feel really bad. He's going to come visit me thinking I'm dying. Spoiler alert, he didn't. From here on out, Brigham kind of drops off this whole story. And he's just like, I'm out. This is nuts. The smartest guy in this story is Brigham.
So Jane gets out of the hospital, and everything, all this desperate shit that she just did, that she carried through with Brigham, is kind of like foreshadowing. Because she would then go on to make the dumbest decisions in her career as a serial killer. So after she gets out of the hospital, she has nowhere to go. She has no money really to rent, but using her, tried and true charms, Jane is able to rent a cottage from this family. Well, she gets a bright idea when a couple months go by and she can't pay her rent. Her landlord comes knocking on the door. She kills the landlord. And who is the landlord? The landlord is Maddie. Maddie is the wife of Alden. Alden is the brother of Edna. Jane, after she kills Maddie, decides she's going to comfort the grieving husband. Now, this is where Jane really starts to unravel and not think things through. Not only does she kill Maddie just to get into the family, within 2 weeks, Jane kills Alden, Alden's sister Edna, and the daughters Genevieve and Minnie. Now, clearly Jane didn't do her research on next of kin for this family because there were some cousins, some sisters, some aunts, some uncles. There was enough family that noticed, hey, it's been 14 days since they met Jolly Jane, and everybody in the family is dead. They're all ages, and they all just die of natural causes, aka Jane poisoned them. So the family takes their suspicions to the cops. And in 1901, a detective who was looking through this case was like, what does this have in common? Oh yeah, Jane, the red flag. This detective was the first guy to actually know that. But he didn't have enough evidence, so he started following Jane. So they're following her. Jane's not really doing anything suspicious. It's not really known if she knew they were tailing her or not. She never really said anything about it, but they just couldn't find anything on her. And so finally, the cops asked the family, can we dig up Minnie's body and do a toxicology report? So the family says, yes, do whatever you have to do. The toxicology reports came back, and guess what? Minnie died of atropine and morphine poisoning. Bam!
Finally, 1901, Jane gets arrested. So when Jane gets arrested, that's when we really start to hear the things that truly make her even more awful than we ever could have imagined. One thing that makes her an anomaly as a female serial killer, and this is super, super disgusting. We find out that even from the very beginning of when Jane started killing people, when she was a nursing student, she would crawl into bed with her patients after she had administered too much morphine or opium or whatever it was, and she would cuddle them. She would big spoon them as they were unconscious and drifting towards death. And in that limbo between unconsciousness and death, Jane would be sexually aroused, and she would perform certain oral sex on these patients as they were dying, getting her release as they crossed over to the other side, just in that power that she had. Buzz your girlfriend. Oof. For a female serial killer, this is totally not normal. Sexual gratification is very rare to find in a female serial killer. She still remains an anomaly to the female serial killer profile even today. Eventually, in her testimony, Jane would admit to 31 murders, but historians believe that it was probably well over 100 people that she killed. Even after she admitted to these killings and she went to court to put in a plea, Jane told her lawyers that she did not want the insanity plea, even though they were pushing for it, because Jane wasn't done yet, apparently. She actually saw a future in which she wanted to get out of jail, in which she would be free. She would get out and be free, and I guess keep doing what she was doing. Jane knew that if she put in an insanity plea, she would be in an asylum for the rest of her life, with no access to poison or power. Later, Jane would also tell her lawyers that, quote, she wanted to be the person who killed more helpless victims than any other man or woman in the world. You're probably thinking, oh, so she had that whole complex where she was like the angel of death to ease suffering, yada, yada, yada. No. This wasn't about easing anybody's pain. This was the fact that she got off on this suffering. She got off on that power to kill these helpless people. Jane, you just really suck. At the end of the day, her lawyers won out. We don't know how, because we all know from Jane's history that she was pretty persuasive, but her lawyers went ahead and they put in the insanity plea. The trial, which was only 8 hours long, consisted of Jane taking the stand and blaming her inclination to murder on the fact that her boyfriend dumped her when she was 16 and she had never quite recovered. She said that if that hadn't happened, if she hadn't had a bad breakup, she probably would have had a family and she would have had, quote, kids and a husband to occupy her time so she wouldn't want to kill anybody. Okay. Can you imagine for every person that's had a bad breakup or been dumped, and when they were 16, no doubt, if they all turned out to be murdered, no one would be alive. Not only was the trial super short at 8 hours long, but it only took the jury 27 minutes to convict Jane and sent her to the insane asylum for the rest of her life. They sent her to Toppan State Hospital, where she lived out the rest of her long days just keeping to herself, living a pretty jovial life, until she died in August of 1938. But she still had her fun in her own way. The hospital staff there would report that she would be in her room when she would call for the nurses, and when they would come in, she would just be smiling from ear to ear, and she would say things like, "Get the morphine, dearie. We'll go out in the ward and we'll have tons of fun watching them all die."
Sounds like someone sick. How lovely. I do hope it's serious. Something dreadful.
And that is the story of Jolly Jane Toppan to round out your St. Patty's Day week. All right. I mean, I have no appetite after this story, but we gotta try it, right? You guys have your Lucky Charms ready? You know what I just found out? My husband has never had Lucky Charms. I don't know how I feel about that. You guys, it's not bad. But I wonder if just like anything tastes good right now after the nasty that was that whole story. I'm not kidding. You guys should try this. Anyway, what did you think of the cheese plate? Did you do this one? Did you do one of your own? What true crime do you want to see themed up with a charcuterie board? Let me know in the comments below. I hope you have a great St. Patty's Day week. And remember, on average, there are as many as 50 serial killers active out there today. So, sweet dreams on that note, and see you next week. Cheers!